The increasing sea made it necessary for us to drag the boats farther up the beach. This was a task for all hands, and after much labour we got the boats into safe positions among the rocks and made fast the painters to big boulders. Then I discussed with Wild and Worsley the chances of reaching South Georgia before the winter locked the seas against us. Some effort had to be made to secure relief. Privation and exposure had left their mark on the party, and the health and mental condition of several men were causing me serious anxiety. Blackborrow's feet, which had been frostbitten during the boat journey, were in a bad way, and the two doctors feared that an operation would be necessary. They told me that the toes would have to be amputated unless animation could be restored within a short period. Then the food supply was a vital consideration. We had left 10 cases of provisions in the crevice of the rocks at our first camping place on the island. An examination of our stores showed that we had full rations for the whole party for a period of 5 weeks. The rations could be spread over 3 months on a reduced allowance, and probably would be supplemented by seals and sea elephants to some extent. I did not dare to count with full confidence on supplies of meat and blubber, for the animals seemed to have deserted the beach, and the winter was near. Our stocks included 3 seals and 2.5 skins with blubber attached. We were mainly dependent on the blubber for fuel, and after making a preliminary survey of the situation, I decided that the party must be limited to 1 hot meal a day. A boat journey in search of relief was necessary and must not be delayed. That conclusion was forced upon me. The nearest port where assistance could certainly be secured was Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands, 540 miles away. But we could scarcely hope to beat up against the prevailing northwesterly wind in a frail and weakened boat with a small sail area. South Georgia was over 800 miles away, but lay in the area of the west winds, and I could count upon finding whalers at any of the whaling stations on the east coast. A boat party might make the voyage and be back with relief within a month, provided that the sea was clear of ice and the boats survived the great seas. It was not difficult to decide that South Georgia must be the objective, and I proceeded to plan ways and means. The hazards of a boat journey across 800 miles of stormy sub-Antarctic ocean were obvious, but I calculated that at worst the venture would add nothing to the risks of the men left on the island. There would be fewer mouths to feed during the winter, and the boat would not require to take more than 1 month's provisions for 6 men. For if we did not make South Georgia in that time, we were sure to go under. A consideration that had weight with me was that there was no chance at all of any search being made for us on Elephant Island. The case required to be argued in some detail, since all hands knew that the perils of the proposed journey were extreme. The risk was justified solely by our urgent need of assistance. The ocean south of Cape Horn in the middle of May is known to be the most tempestuous, storm-swept area of water in the world. The weather then is unsettled. The skies are dull and overcast, and the gales are almost unceasing. We had to face these conditions in a small and weather-beaten boat, already strained by the work of the months that had passed. Worsley and Wild realized that the attempt must be made, and they both asked to be allowed to accompany me on the voyage. I told Wilde at once that he would have to stay behind. I relied upon him to hold the party together while I was away, and to make the best of his way to Deception Island with the men in the spring, in the event of our failure to bring help. Worsley I would take with me, for I had a very high opinion of his accuracy and quickness as a navigator, and especially in the snapping and working out of positions in difficult circumstances, an opinion that was only enhanced during the actual journey. 4 other men would be required, and I decided to call for volunteers, although, as a matter of fact, I pretty well knew which of the people I would select. Crean I proposed to leave on the island as a right-hand man for Wilde, but he begged so hard to be allowed to come in the boat that after consultation with Wilde I promised to take him. I called the men together, explained my plan, and asked for volunteers. Many came forward at once. Some were not fit for the work that would have to be done, and others would not have been much use in the boat, since they were not seasoned sailors, though the experiences of recent months entitled them to some consideration as seafaring men. McElroy and Macklin were both anxious to go, but realized that their duty lay on the island with the sick men. They suggested that I should take Blackborough, in order that he might have shelter and warmth as quickly as possible, but I had to veto this idea. It would be hard enough for fit men to live in the boat. Indeed, I did not see how a sick man, lying helpless in the bottom of the boat, could possibly survive in the heavy weather we were sure to encounter. I finally selected McNeish, McCarthy and Vincent, in addition to Worsley and Crean. The crew seemed a strong one, and as I looked at the men, I felt confidence increasing. The decision made, I walked through the blizzard with Worsley and Wilde to examine the James Caird. The 20-foot boat had never looked big. She appeared to have shrunk in some mysterious way when I viewed her in the light of our new undertaking. She was an ordinary ship's whaler, fairly strong, but showing signs of the strain she had endured since the crushing of the Endurance. Where she was holed in leaving the pack was, fortunately, above the waterline and easily patched. Standing beside her, we glanced at the fringe of the storm-swept, tumultuous sea that formed our path. Clearly, our voyage would be a big adventure. I called the carpenter and asked if he could do anything to make the boat more seaworthy. He first inquired if he was to go with me, and seemed quite pleased when I said yes. He was over 50 years of age, and not altogether fit, but he had a good knowledge of sailing boats, and was very quick. McCarthy said that he could contrive some sort of covering for the James Caird, if he might use the lids of the cases and the 4 sledge runners that we had lashed inside the boat for use in the event of a landing on Graham Land at Wilhelmina Bay. This bay, at one time the goal of our desire, had been left behind in the course of our drift, but we had retained the runners. The carpenter proposed to complete the covering with some of our canvas, and he set about making his plans at once. Noon had passed, and the gale was more severe than ever. We could not proceed with our preparations that day. The tents were suffering in the wind, and the sea was rising. We made our way to the snow slope at the shoreward end of the spit, with the intention of digging a hole in the snow large enough to provide shelter for the party. I had an idea that Wilde and his men might camp there during my absence, since it seemed impossible that the tent could hold together for many more days against the attacks of the wind. But an examination of the spot indicated that any hole we could dig probably would be filled quickly by the drift. At dark, about 5 p.m, we all turned in, after a supper consisting of a pannikin of hot milk, one of our precious biscuits, and a cold penguin leg each. The gale was stronger than ever on the following morning, April 20. No work could be done. Blizzard and snow, snow and blizzard, sudden lulls and fierce returns. During the lulls, we could see on the far horizon to the northeast bergs of all shapes and sizes driving along before the gale, and the sinister appearance of the swift-moving masses made us thankful indeed that, instead of battling with the storm amid the ice, we were required only to face the drift from the glaciers and the inland heights. The gusts might throw us off our feet, but at least we fell on solid ground, and not on the rocking floes. 2 seals came up on the beach that day, one of them within 10 yards of my tent. So urgent was our need of food and blubber that I called all hands and organised a line of beaters instead of simply walking up to the seal and hitting it on the nose. We were prepared to fall upon this seal en masse if it attempted to escape. The kill was made with a pick handle, and in a few minutes 5 days' food and 6 days' fuel was stowed in a place of safety among the boulders above high water mark. During this day, the cook, who had worked well on the floe and throughout the boat journey, suddenly collapsed. I happened to be at the galley at the moment and saw him fall. I pulled him down the slope to his tent and pushed him into its shelter, with orders to his tent mates to keep him in his sleeping bag until I allowed him to come out, or the doctor said he was fit enough. Then I took out to replace the cook, one of the men who had expressed a desire to lie down and die. The task of keeping the galley fire alight was both difficult and strenuous, and it took his thoughts away from the chances of immediate dissolution. In fact, I found him a little later, gravely concerned over the drying of a naturally not over-clean pair of socks, which were hung up in close proximity to our evening milk. Occupation had brought his thoughts back to the ordinary cares of life. There was a lull in the bad weather on April 21, and the carpenter started to collect material for the decking of the James Caird. He fitted the mast of the Stancombe wheels fore and aft inside the James Caird as a hogback, and thus strengthened the keel with the object of preventing our boat hogging, that is, buckling in heavy seas. He had not sufficient wood to provide a deck, but by using the sledge runners and box lids, he made a framework extending from the forecastle aft to a well. It was a patched-up affair, but it provided a base for a canvas covering. We had a bolt of canvas frozen stiff, and this material had to be cut and then thawed out over the blubber stove foot by foot, in order that it might be sewn into the form of a cover. When it had been nailed and screwed into position, it certainly gave an appearance of safety to the boat, though I had an uneasy feeling that it bore a strong likeness to stage scenery, which may look like a granite wall, and is in fact nothing better than canvas and lath. As events proved, the covering served its purpose well. We certainly could not have lived through the voyage without it. Another fierce gale was blowing on April 22, interfering with our preparations for the voyage. The cooker from number 5 tent came adrift in a gust, and although it was chased to the water's edge, it disappeared for good. Blackborough's feet were giving him much pain, and McElroy and Macklin thought it would be necessary for them to operate soon. They were under the impression then that they had no chloroform, but they found some subsequently in the medicine chest after we had left. Some cases of stores, left on a rock off the spit on the day of our arrival, were retrieved during this day. We were setting aside stores for the boat journey and choosing the essential equipment from the scanty stock at our disposal. 2 10-gallon casks had to be filled with water, melted down from ice collected at the foot of the glacier. This was a rather slow business. The blubber stove was kept going all night, and the watchman emptied the water into the casks from the pot in which the ice was melted. A working party started to dig a hole in the snow slope about 40 feet above sea level, with the object of providing a site for a camp. They made fairly good progress at first, but the snow drifted down unceasingly from the inland ice, and in the end the party had to give up the project. The weather was fine on April 23, and we hurried forward our preparations. It was on this day I decided finally that the crew for the James Caird should consist of Worsley, Crean, McNeish, McCarthy, Vincent and myself. A storm came on about noon, with driving snow and heavy squalls. Occasionally the air would clear for a few minutes, and we could see a line of pack ice 5 miles out, driving across from west to east. This sight increased my anxiety to get away quickly. Winter was advancing, and soon the pack might close completely round the island, and stay our departure for days or even for weeks. I did not think that ice would remain around Elephant Island continuously during the winter, since the strong winds and fast currents would keep it in motion. We had noticed ice and bergs going past at the rate of 4 or 5 knots. A certain amount of ice was held up about the end of our spit, but the sea was clear where the boat would have to be launched. Worsley, Wilde and I climbed to the summit of the seaward rocks and examined the ice from a better vantage point than the beach offered. The belt of pack ice outside appeared to be sufficiently broken for our purposes, and I decided that unless the conditions forbade it, we would make a start in the James Caird on the following morning. Obviously, the pack might close at any time. This decision made, I spent the rest of the day looking over the boat, gear and stores, and discussing plans with Worsley and Wilde.